So please welcome Robert Wilson. Thank you particularly for being here. To say that you have a busy schedule is kind of a hilarious understatement. I mean, you have so many things going on. I'm sure there are about half a dozen big productions around the world. So I know that time is an important, precious commodity for you. So thank you for sharing your time.
Thank you, Wendy.
So let's start with why Buster Keaton, why the General?
In 1967, a deaf-mute boy came to stay with me, and the following year I wrote a play that was 2 hours long. It was called The King of Spain, and we wrote it together. He had never been to school, and he knew no words, and the people with whom he had lived didn't understand that his problem was one of not hearing. And my play was based on observations of the boy, things that he would notice that I didn't notice, being a hearing person. And the following year in 1969, I made a work called The Life and Times of Sigmund Freud. And many of the scenes in the work were influenced by the deaf boy and observations he had. And these works were all silent. And in 1970, I made a 7-hour work that was, I showed part of it in New York and in Iowa. But it was a 7-hour long play that was again silent. And I went to the theater when I first came to New York and to study architecture, and I didn't particularly like it and still don't. But I didn't really like cinema so much, but I liked the silent movies. And I just came from a rehearsal. Today I'm doing Verdi's Otello, and I'm staging the whole work silently first, and later I put the music with it. But I always liked Buster Keaton. He was my favorite actor. And in 1971, I did the entire 7 hours of The Deaf Man Glance in Paris, and much to my surprise, we had a tremendous success. We played 5.5 months to 2,000 people every night for a play that was 7 hours long and silent. And Eugene Ionesco came and 2 or 3 times, and he wrote about it. He said, Robert Wilson has gone further than Samuel Beckett because he did 7 hours of silence. And in 1973, I guess, so after having made a 24-hour silent play, a 7-day play that was silent, a 12-hour opera that was silent from 7 in the evening, 7 in the morning, I made a play called A Letter for Queen Victoria in 73, and we were in Paris, and I was told one evening that Samuel Beckett was going to come. And after the performance, he came backstage and he said, I told him how much I admired his work and that he was actually my favorite playwright. And he had complimented me on A Letter for Queen Victoria, the play he had just seen. And I said how much I'd liked Madeleine Renaud, who was performing his play Happy Days. And I said, he said, you know, she's a great actress because she doesn't really understand a word of what she's saying. It's all timing. And I said, who is your favorite actor? And he said, oh, there's really only one. And I said, who is that? And Beckett said, Buster Keaton. And I said, oh, he's mine too. And several weeks later, we had dinner, and we talked, and he told me how much he admired Keaton and Chaplin, and we talked about how that everything was artificial, the makeup and the acting, and I said it was such a relief for me to see his work, Keaton's work, and Chaplin, the silent movie actors, because it was all timing, it was all dance. And we shouldn't make theater if we can't laugh. And ever since that time, and even today, I staged Wagner's Ring, I did King Lear, I've done many works. I always stage them silently first. And I think it really goes back to the silent movies and this genius, Buster Keaton. I think of Hamlet. That when Hamlet dies, he says, had I but time, had I but time, oh, I could tell you, but let it be. And the rest is silence.
Thank you. Besides the silence that Buster Keaton brings to his work, there's a certain humanity, and even more so than Chaplin, because he invites us to not pity him, but to relate to him. And when you watch the film tonight, do you see some bits of business and some things that you've put in your work over the years?
Yes, his face is amazing. He's never pushing too hard. It's almost like a kabuki actor or something. It's like a mask, so that the deep emotion is inner, and it's not outside. And so I think from watching Keaton, and when I was much younger, it had a tremendous influence in so many ways. Look at theater today, or movies, how that his eyes are choreographed. There's a theatrical language of just movement of eyes, and it's almost forgotten today.
And they're not broad. It's not a double take. It's subtle.
No. Yeah, and I always say it's the space in back of you that gives you power. If you're on the stage and you feel this space in back of you, then the space in front of you is much stronger. And Keaton has these eyes in back of him and in front. And it's measuring this space that goes forward and backwards. So they can be more in back of you or more in front of you, but it's like a bow. And but the space in back of him, it gives him a power. And so much of what we see today in terms of actors is this space. But this space makes you noble.
And you said you weren't crazy about movies. Was that an earlier feeling, or have you come around? Do you go to the movies much now?
I don't go a lot because I simply don't have time, but
That's okay.
I don't like naturalism, and I never did. And to me, trying to act natural always seemed artificial. And what I like about something like what we saw tonight, it's all artificial. So in a funny way, it seems more natural to me. And that's why I was attracted to, later when I went to Japan in 1980, and I saw the no theater and classical theater, I felt very at ease or comfortable with that theatrical language, that it was totally artificial, but somehow, again, it was closer to nature. And I always liked dance. Balanchine, I've said many times, was to me the Mozart of the 20th century. And what, you know, he's buried right here in Sag Harbor, in Balanchine. But watching Balanchine's work, neoclassic ballet and compositions, was never tiring. And I still go back and see Balanchine's work, and it's still, to me, it's of the 20th century, one of the great things that happened. But I liked it because of the formality, the way people behaved on stage. They didn't demand too much your attention, and that draws you to them. But I think that's why I also like Buster Keaton, is that, again, it's all dance, and it was not being thrust in my face. And it's the most difficult thing to do, of course, is comedy, because it's timing. It's where the, you know, it's waiting for the toast to pop out of the toaster.
Speaking of naturalism, there was a documentary made by Katerina, about you, by Katerina Otto Bernstein in 2006. And if any of you have not seen it, I would recommend it. I don't know how easy it is to find at this point, but it's called Absolute Wilson, and it's terrific. She really digs deep, I think. How did you feel being scrutinized under that sort of documentary lens?
Nervous.
But it's a wonderful product at the end.
Oh, well. I always feel a bit uncomfortable if I read something I've said or see myself, or but it was great because Katerina really, I felt very comfortable. You know how I met her? It's a good story. One night, some years ago, I guess it's 15, 16 years ago, I was invited to a dinner party here in the Hamptons, and my assistant, I don't drive, and my assistant drove me there and let me out, and I walked into this house, and it's strange, I really don't know too many people, and I think I'm in the wrong place, but this woman came up to me and she said, "And who are you?" I said, "Well, my name is Bob Wilson." She said, "Oh, are you the one that works in the theater?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, well, I'm your hostess." I said, "Oh, I'm in the wrong dinner party." She said, "Do you smoke?" And at that time I did. So I said, "Yes." She said, "Can I have a cigarette?" So she took me to a room in the house and closed the door, and we stayed an hour and a half smoking cigarettes. And she said, "You know, I'd like to make a film about you." And I said, "Okay, let's do it." That's how I met her.
That's great. Let's take some questions from the audience. Anybody like to begin? Yes, right here.
I wonder what your thoughts are. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the relationship between music and silent film. It's almost impossible to see silent films in theaters without music, so they really aren't silent unless you're at home and you hit the mute button on your remote. In this case, we had a symphony orchestra, really. Mm-hmm. But the irony is that at one point when I thought, well, I want to see them silently, It was awful. It's just I tried watching this film, actually, without any sound whatsoever. And real silence just doesn't seem to work. It's you know, they kind of had it right that you needed at least a piano or something. I'm just wondering how you feel about that.
Well, I mean, just like I was directing Othello, and I'm also doing other projects this summer. I start with them silent, but I have Verdi's music, so then or I have words. Or, but to me, I think one reason I didn't like theater is because what I was seeing was always a kind of decoration or illustration of what I was hearing. So usually a playwright writes a play, and then a director gets a cast together, and they sit around and they read the play, and then they get up and they try to act it, and they speak it, and then you have someone who designs costumes that are illustrating a character. Then you have a stage decor. Stage decoration for a play. And for me, it should be architectural. The Lord gave us eyes and He gave us ears. And what we see can be as important as what we hear. So I concentrate first on what I see, and then later I put the audio with it. And as John Cage said, there's no such thing as silence. There's always silence. There's always sound. Sometimes when we were very quiet, we become more aware of sound. I once met Marlin Dietrich when I first went to Paris. Yes. Whoa. And I watched her a number of times performing because Pierre Cardin was producing my play, and he was also producing her at the Espace Cardin in Paris. And I got my courage one evening, and I said, "Miss Dietrich, could I invite you for dinner?" She said, "With pleasure." So I had dinner with her. And there was a man came to the table and said, "Oh, Miss Dietrich, you're so cold when you perform." And she said, "But you didn't listen to my voice." And she said, the difficulty is to place the voice with the face. And I didn't quite understand at the time. I was 27 or 28. But if you think about it, I mean, she was icy cold with her movements, her gestures, which were very minimal. But the voice could be very hot and sexy. And so what I don't particularly like the music tonight, but that doesn't matter. It's structuring what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. And if what I'm seeing is not just a decoration here, what you're seeing happened first. I wrote an opera with Philip Glass, several, but we did one that was called The White Raven. And I staged it silently first. There was no music. Phil had no idea what the music would be. We determined the length of time and an idea. Then we filmed it. And we took what I had done silently, and a Portuguese poet wrote poems, text with it. And Philip took the timing from the film that was silent and wrote the music and the vocal parts. But it started silently first with gestures and movement, and I made sort of sketches of the decor, the stage set, and but it started visually first. So I think it really goes back to my fascination with the silent movies and Buster Keaton. It had a really profound influence on my work.
In the case of this film, would you have preferred a piano score or something a little more
I think so,
simplistic?
yeah.
Interesting.
Me, I mean, that's just personal, but
Yeah, no,
I
that's
feel more comfortable with that.
right. Yes.
So, what a genius, and your insights. At the same time, I'm kind of aware of a sort of historical reality, too. This is the era when this film is made, when the Klan was the strongest in America it ever was, when a lot of the statues that are being debated now were built. This is between Birth of a Nation, which was once considered one of the greatest films ever made,
Yes.
and Gone with the Wind, which is by many more popularly, but considered one of the, well, we look at those films so differently now. Here's a film where he decides to be a Southern rebel, and there's not a touch of racism anywhere in the film, unlike the other two that I named. And yet, in terms of the historical context, I could well imagine people in the South who are now defending the Confederacy looking at this and saying, see, this is the history we want to save. So your thoughts about how history changes and our views of history.
Sometimes I make a drawing and I say, wow, that's the best drawing I ever made. And I look at it the next morning and I say, it doesn't look so good today. And I see it 5 years later, I say, maybe something's there. And then, 20 years later, it's very different. And only by living with the work or looking at it in time do we really understand. So time gives us a certain perspective that and I think that a great work for me will always be great, but again, I go back to the Symphony in C of Balanchine or something. I can see it over and over, and I think that 200 years from now we'll still be looking at it. Its principles are classic. And the classics are the only thing that will remain. And to me, Buster Keaton is a classical actor, a great one. And it's always so fragile between comedy and tragedy. But I think that's one reason naturalism and the films today, maybe I'll see them differently. One will look at them differently in the future, but
Well, there is a classicism in Keaton that we respond to, and actually has been revived in terms of popularity. A friend of mine just mentioned that young people are seeing him as a performance artist, and he before he died, he had a retrospective at the Venice Film Festival. Sight and Sound deemed this film one of the 10 best films ever, and not just silent, but all films. So you and Samuel Beckett have certainly chosen well, I think.
I do now Krapp's last tape. I performed it. I've been performing it for, I guess, 6 or maybe 8 years. And I have Buster Keaton's, a photo of Buster Keaton in the dressing room. I look at it every night before I have to perform it, and I think he would be one of the actors that withstand time. I mean, it's too soon to really know, but I think there'll only be a handful, and I think his work has the possibility to be with us, 100 years from now. But it's too soon to know.
Well, not really.
Well,
2026 is coming right up.
26. Not too far away.
Yeah. Any other questions? Hillary, did you have a question? No.
If you could have dinner with Buster Keaton now, what would you discuss?
If you could have dinner with Buster Keaton,
Oh, I don't. I guess just say thank you. You know, he. It's amazing, and it's very close to my work, but these things are rehearsed over and over and over and over and over and over, so that it's timing. And I don't know his process. I mean, how did he make this film? But Charlie Chaplin said that there'd be 150 takes or 75 or 200 takes of one scene over and over and over. He came to see the Deaf Man Glance in 1971 in Paris, and there was a young girl that he came backstage, and she said, "Oh, Mr. Chaplin, when you do the flea act in Limelight, how did you come to do that?" He says, "My dear, I've been doing that for 45 years." So the vaudeville actors were repeating over and over and over, and till the first time you do something is free. But in order to get that freedom again, it's a lot of work. And so it's technically learning it, going back and repeating it and repeating it and repeating until it has more or less the same freedom that it had in the beginning. And these actors, was growing up in vaudeville, doing these acts over and over and over. And the flea act in Chaplin's Limelight is, the girl was asking, said, "Oh, I saw Limelight," but he said, it's in all my films. So.
Any other questions?
To be mechanical is the only way of gaining freedom. So that through repetition over and over and over. I mean, you never learn anything, completely learn it, but you're 4 years old and you're learning to play Mozart, and you're 84 and you're playing it maybe differently, but you're still learning how to play it. But the more you do it, Martha Graham said in her autobiography, the first line, "I am a dancer. I learn by practice."
I wanted to ask about the director's role in this film. Was it a highly collaborative process between him and Keaton? It was beautifully edited. I thought it was astonishingly tight film. He managed to retain all the fluidity of Keaton within the overarching behavior of the film itself, which I thought was really impressive. I don't really know about their relationship. I'm wondering if there's if they were very close, if it was in fact collaborative. Would you know?
I think Wendy would know better than I, but it is always a collaborative process. When I'm working, it's only, I mean, I can do certain things and maybe give a direction, but it's a...
I actually don't know what the extent of the collaboration was in terms of who shared what role, but he did get the co-director's credit. So I would imagine he would have been involved with storyline and setting up the shots. And some of those shots were extraordinary too. Not only the feat of creating them, but the beauty of some of them. The soldiers running by the group of horses just seemed very beautiful, and there was silhouetted
But all
shoulder-
choreographed. I mean, it's
Yes.
all like dance.
and beautifully and without playing it too long. I'd like to know, and I can dig deeper, but I couldn't sort of break it down for you.
Does anyone here know how many frames per second these films were shot in? Because there is that sort of jerky quality with a lot of silent movies, and to me, in one way, it makes it more artificial, but it can also make it more archetypal because it doesn't feel like you're watching.
I don't know. It's an interesting question, but
I don't know. Don, do you know? Don?
They were shot at 16 and played back at 16.
Mhm.
And I don't know why this felt a little bit jerky, but when we see silent films that were shot in 16 and they're played back at 24 frames or something like that, then they seem very jerky, but that's not the way they were meant to be.
I think, John, what is really fascinating to me is the flicker. And if you blink your eyes, or all of us are blinking, but what do you see in that fraction of a second, this negative image? And here the eye is flickering more because of the frames, I don't know, per second, but it means that this negative image is also perhaps becoming more apparent. There was Joseph Conrad who made those films in the 60s, a flicker. There'd be 24 frames in a second, so you would have 3 black frames, 3 white frames, 3 black, 3 white, 7 something. And it was structured in black and white, so what you saw was flickering, and it was 1 hour long. And I went and saw it, and I saw a Western movie, cowboys and Indians or whatever, but people saw all different things because the interior image becomes mingled with the exterior image. When I did the Life and Times of Joseph Stalin, it started at 7 in the evening, went to 7 in the morning, and people are closing their eyes longer and then opening. And someone came to me and said, "Oh, that red elephant you had on stage was great." Well, there was no red elephant, but she had seen it because this interior image was being mingled with exterior images. And it's something in that flicker of the silent movies that also fascinated me. I've for a long time been interested in what do we see in the blink of an eye? Are you dreaming for a fraction of a second? But it's a way of seeing. And I think that these silent movies induce that interior screen, visual screen.
I think, too, some of those shots were speeded up. When Keaton goes flying over a caboose or something, they were probably speeded up in the laboratory, but most of them were shot with this mysterious sort of time lapse. I saw red and blue, red and green tonight when I was watching it.
Yeah.
Little blocks of color.
Mhm.
So, any other questions? Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for doing something here this evening on stage that probably comes naturally to you, but which in my life is very, very rare. You almost never see it on stage, and you almost never see it on television. I can count 3 times. I'm 69, and I've only seen it 3 times on television, which is that you allowed yourself, you carved out the space for yourself to just think on stage without doing anything, without needing to fill in that gap. My acting teacher, Earl Hyman, down at HB Studio used to say there's nothing more interesting on stage than thought as it's burning hot like fire, but you almost never see it. The gaps are always being filled in. And for me, it was as riveting to watch you figure something out as you were sitting here as it was to listen to you to speak. And I just loved it. That's now the 4th time that I've ever seen it. So I appreciate it. I mean, as I say, it probably comes naturally to you, but it's very, very, very rare.
My mother, she was not a person of very many words, and sometimes she wouldn't say anything, or then she would just say a few words. But she always took time to think. And she only saw one production of mine. She died at an early age, and she said, "Oh, it gave me time to think."
Very nice, very nice. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you so much for being with us tonight. And thank you all
you.
for being here too.
Have a great evening.